Hey everyone, Nigel and Luke here, and welcome to Crime Zone. Though it might sound absurd on its face, notable documented instances of the so-called sleepwalking defense in criminal trials date back to at least the 1800s. The premise is easy enough to understand. Unlike in most normal cases where a defendant wants a judge and/or jury to believe that they weren't involved in a particular crime, defendants invoking the sleepwalking defense instead readily admit that they committed illegal acts, but argue that since they were asleep at the time, they are not criminally responsible due to a lack of awareness or intent behind their actions. For obvious reasons, the legal defense remains highly controversial, with experts in the field of sleep research continuing to disagree about how cases of this nature should be presented in court. This is especially true when it comes to instances of violent crime or murder, the trials for which already tend to be complex enough without this added wrench thrown into the works. However, since these cases are nothing if not interesting, we decided that this week we would take a look at two of the most controversial examples of crimes like this that we could find. Before we get to the videos, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this. It really helps us to continue building the channel, and if you've watched a few of our videos already, you might not even realize that you're not subscribed. While you're there, don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest releases. With that out of the way, here is part 1 of two controversial crimes involving the sleepwalking defense.
On the night of January 16, 1997, Arizona's Phoenix Police Department received a disturbing 911 call. The call was placed by a man named Greg Coons, who told authorities he had just witnessed his neighbor committing a murder. According to Coons, as he and his girlfriend were getting ready for bed around 10 p.m. that night, they had heard what sounded like moaning or crying outside. When he went to investigate, Coons realized that the sounds were coming from the backyard next door, the home where husband and wife Scott and Yarmila Falater live with their 2 adolescent children. Coons told authorities that as he peered over the wall dividing their properties, he had seen Yarmila Falater lying on the ground. He had then witnessed Scott Falater go in and out of the house several times, at one point stopping to stand over Yarmila's body for several minutes. After that, Scott had dragged her over to their in-ground pool and held her head underwater. When police arrived at the Falater home shortly before 11 p.m., they found Yarmila's lifeless body still floating in the water. It appeared that her murder had been even more harrowing than what Coons had described. In addition to being drowned, she had been stabbed 44 times. A responding officer would later remark that the scene in the pool was reminiscent of a shark attack. As police took in the horrifying details of the killing, they noticed a man in a t-shirt and red pajama pants moving around on the second floor of the home. He was quickly identified as Scott Falater. Officers rushed into the residence and intercepted Scott as he was walking down the stairs. After shouting at him to get onto the ground, one of the officers asked him who else was in the house. Curiously, Scott replied that there were 3 others, his 2 kids and his wife. After confirming that the Falaters' 2 children were safe in their beds, Scott was arrested and taken in for questioning. Just before 2 a.m., he was interviewed by Detective John Norman, a veteran of the police department. Though Norman was sure that they were dealing with an open and shut case against Scott, it was here that investigators got their first indication that things were about to become considerably stranger. During the interview, Scott appeared confused about his wife's death and repeatedly said that he did not know what had happened, even after Norman explained that his neighbor had seen him murdering his wife. When Norman pointed out that Scott had blood on his neck, he said that he also did not know how it had gotten there. He also could not explain an injury to his hand which had been covered by a band-aid. All Scott could say was that he had gone to bed as usual that night, and the next thing he remembered was being woken up by the sounds of his family's 2 barking dogs and coming face to face with police. Understandably, Norman assumed that Scott was simply lying, and came away from the interview still completely convinced of his guilt. Scott was subsequently charged with the first-degree murder of his wife. As police conducted further interviews with Coons and his girlfriend and collected evidence from the crime scene, the case against Scott only seemed to grow more damning. This was especially true after a search of the Falaters' garage revealed several blood-soaked items in the trunk of Scott's Volvo station wagon. In addition to a blood-soaked t-shirt, investigators found a clear plastic container holding more blood-stained clothes, as well as the weapon that had been used to stab Yarmila, a large hunting knife. Next to the container was a trash bag, which contained similarly blood-covered leather gloves and leather boots. To investigators, this was evidence that Scott had tried to cover up the crime, even if he had done so poorly. Though the physical evidence in the case was strong, investigators were still unable to come up with a motive behind the brutal crime. Interviews with the Falater's children, family, and friends failed to uncover any signs of turbulence in their marriage. Scott and Yarmila were high school sweethearts who had married before their senior year of college in Illinois. Though they were raised Catholic, they had eventually both converted to Mormonism and by all accounts had remained devoutly religious and active in the church throughout their adult lives. After starting their family, Scott and Yarmila moved around a bit before settling in Arizona, where Scott had taken a job working as an electrical engineer at a Motorola semiconductor facility. Despite long and stressful work hours, Scott had always made time for his family. In fact, at the time of Yarmila's death, the Falaters had been planning a family trip to Europe. None of Scott's behavior in the weeks or months before the brutal killing seemed to portray the slightest indication that he had planned to commit a murder. His defense team would soon argue that this was because Scott was actually innocent. At trial, they would argue that Scott had indeed carried out the brutal killing, but that he had been sleepwalking at the time and was completely unaware of his actions. Instead of a cold-blooded murder, the defense would argue that the death of Yarmila Falater was a tragic accident. Though this legal defense seemed outrageous even to Scott when it was initially proposed, he became convinced after his lawyer Mike Kimmer consulted experts on the subject of sleepwalking. Kimmer had first stumbled onto the theory when he interviewed the primary witness to the crime, Greg Coons, who described the calm, emotionless demeanor with which Scott had carried out the killing. Scott's mother, who was present during the interview, mentioned that her son had a history of sleepwalking when he was younger, which immediately interested Kimmer. Scott's mother described several instances, especially when Scott was under significant stress when he had experienced powerful sleepwalking episodes. In at least 2 of those instances, he had physically resisted or violently lashed out when someone had tried to stop him from leaving the house. With the help of 2 leading sleep experts, Scott underwent testing using a device called polysomnograph. The tool measures data including brain waves and muscle action and was used to determine if Scott fit the profile of a sleepwalker. The test concluded that he did. Based on these results and the testimony of the sleep experts, at trial, Scott's defense team sought to recontextualize the events on and before the night of June 16th. This began with Scott's recollection of the evening. He said that he arrived home from work like usual between 7 and 7:30 p.m. that night and ate dinner with Yarmila and his children. After dinner, he spent some time on his computer working on a lesson plan he was going to teach as part of a weekday morning religious education class he did for youth at his church. At around 9 p.m. that night, Scott said he briefly went out into the backyard to take a look at the pool filter because Yarmila had told him that it was broken. After a short and unsuccessful attempt to fix it, he went back inside. It was too dark to work on the problem properly, and he was exhausted after a long day. He claimed that Yarmila had fallen asleep on the couch while watching TV, and that he said goodnight to her before he headed upstairs to bed. The next thing he remembered was being woken up by the sounds of the barking dogs. Scott's defense team argued that sometime after he had gone to bed that night, he had started sleepwalking and had gone out into the yard. They theorized that in his unconscious state, he had tried to resume fixing the pool filter and that this had awoken Yarmila, who had tried to bring Scott back inside. This caused Scott to lash out violently, killing Yarmila because his mind perceived her as a threat. This version of events also sought to explain pieces of seemingly damning evidence as instead part of Scott's sleepwalking episode. A flashlight that had been found by the pool when police arrived was seen as a possible sign that Scott believed he was still trying to fix the pool filter. A cut had also been made to one of the components inside with a knife. Furthermore, the blood-soaked clothes and other items found in Scott's trunk were alleged to be clothes that he wore when he was doing jobs around the house. Because these items were normally kept in the same container in the trunk where investigators found them, it was argued that instead of hiding the evidence, Scott may have simply been returning those items to their usual place while sleepwalking. According to Scott's defense team, the sleepwalking also explained the calm and expressionless way that he had carried out the killing. It also seemed to explain why Coons had observed him go in and out of the house so many times, and stand over his wife's body for a period of time without doing anything. As an explanation for what had triggered the sleepwalking episode, the defense pointed out that Scott had been under significant stress at his job at Motorola. He was in charge of a failing project and confided in with his wife before her death that he knew it was only a matter of time before the project was scrapped and many of those working under him would be laid off. Scott supposedly felt extremely guilty about this and had been working even more than usual in a futile attempt to stop this from happening. The stress of the work had greatly impacted his sleep patterns leading up to the killing, with him usually sleeping less than 4 hours a night for several days in a row, after which he would crash and be asleep for 9 to 10 hours. Scott claimed that the night of his wife's death had been one of his crash nights. To combat the testimony of the defense's sleep experts, the prosecution sought to introduce doubts about the feasibility of the sleepwalking theory of the case. In particular, they zeroed in on the number of specific and complex actions that Scott would have supposedly needed to do while asleep. This turned out to be extremely effective and was one of the major contributing factors behind the jury's subsequent guilty verdict. On June 25, 1999, Scott Falater was found guilty of the first-degree murder of his wife. At his sentencing the following year, he was spared the death penalty due to pleas from his 2 children and was instead sentenced to life in prison. According to reports, they continued to support him before and after his trial, and they have remained in close contact with him since his incarceration. In an interview with ABC News just this past January, Scott told interviewers that he expects to live the rest of his life in prison, but reiterated that he still has no idea what happened that fateful night back in 1997. He said he accepts that witnesses saw him commit the crime and that there is no one else that the responsibility can be placed on. He also says that he is still racked with guilt about his wife's death. The case remains one of the most controversial ever to involve the use of the sleepwalking defense.
Do you know of any other cases like this that you think we should check out? Tell us about them in the comments section below. As always, if you enjoyed our video, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest releases. Thank you for watching.